What's going on, guys? This is Brandon from Walker's Woodworks. I just wanted to make a kind of simple tutorial video for my first YouTube video on how to make something. So I decided to do a cutting board. So basically here I'm just cutting to length my pieces to start with. I typically do my boards about 16 inches. You can vary it however you'd like. That was a piece of maple I was doing there. This piece here is tiger wood. Tiger wood's really hard and it has a lot of good character in it, so I like to use it a lot. Here I'm just running it over the joiner to get one flat edge because this particular wood didn't come with a finished side, so just run it over here to get a reference edge to use on the table saw. And then here I'm gonna start cutting them to width. You can vary your width, obviously whatever you want. This piece I'm cutting here is a piece of Paduke that I cut, I think about 2 inches, something like that. Got that one done, then just do another one. I like to do my boards pretty symmetrical as far as the design goes, but people get crazy and they do all kinds of stuff, so you can do whatever you want. So this piece is going to be the centerpiece for the board. I use the side that I ran through the joiner and put that up against the fence so I have a nice reference point. It gets a fairly straight edge, but I always like to flip it around and adjust my fence just a little bit and then run it through again on the side that the joiner did against the blade there. That way you make sure it's square to your table saw and to the other side. It helps with the glue up alignment. So then basically you just take your pieces and lay out your board how you want it to look. I got the tiger wood in the middle there, and then some maple, and then the Paduke on the outside. And then I measure it to make sure it's 12 inches or under because that's as wide as my planer is, so I don't want to go over that. So then I lay my clamps out. I use Bessie clamps. It's personal preference. You can use different kinds of clamps if you want, or whichever ones you have. But I also take blue tape, as you'll see here, and I lay it across the clamp rail to keep glue from dripping on it. It's a lot easier to remove the tape than it is to try to clean glue off of your clamp rails. Then you just take your pieces, start laying them out on the clamps. Try to make sure they're fairly lined up and that the clamps are spread a same distance apart. And then I usually use Titebond 3. Well, I always use Titebond 3 for my cutting boards because it's the food safe one. It doesn't set up as quick as Titebond 2, and it holds together really well. So it gives you a little more work time, and it has a lot better adhesion. So just put a nice bead of glue across each piece, making sure not to put a bead of glue on the last piece because you only want it on the faces that are touching each other. And you don't have to, but I like to use the Type Brush by Titebond. Rockler makes one. There's several companies that make brushes for spreading glue, or you can just use your finger if you don't want to use a brush. They do have rollers and stuff. I've kind of found they don't work that great. The brush is just my chosen method. So basically, get the glue all spread out. You want to get quite a bit of glue on there, and then you can start lining them up, getting them even on both sides. Try to hurry and get them pushed against each other before the glue kind of runs out the bottom. Get your clamps even. You're going to want to also make sure that the boards don't bow upwards when you're tightening down. So I do just tighten a little bit on one side, go to the other side, tighten a little bit, go back and forth, check for alignment, check to make sure none of the boards are popping up or anything like that. So get them tightened down, and then I usually grab a third clamp and I put it on top and clamp down that way so you have kind of a more even pressure when you're tightening them down. So I usually let that sit overnight. You can let it sit for 6 to 8 hours, I think, will probably be good. But I always let it sit overnight, and then I take it out of the clamps. pop it up. As you see, the tape peels off fairly easily, and you don't have to worry about glue on your clamps. So then what I do is grab some clamps. You can use any kind of clamps. Clamp it down to the table. I use a scraper I got at Home Depot. They're fairly inexpensive and they work pretty good. I've used several different scrapers and I seem to always go back to this one. So just scrape the glue off as best you can without digging into the wood, off both sides, and then flip it over and do the same on the other side. I'm not going to go through that whole process because I'm trying to keep this video fairly short for you guys, but still trying to show all the steps. So then what I do next is run it through my planer. I don't trim the ends because if there's any snipe or anything from the planer, then you can go ahead and trim that off later. When I should have mentioned in the beginning that I usually cut my boards about ½ inch longer than I want it to end up being. That way if there is anything like that, then you can just trim it off. But I run it through a few passes on each side just to make sure that the glue lines and all that are gone. And then I go to my table saw and I get my crosscut sled. If you don't have a crosscut sled, you can use your miter gauge, or if you have a sliding miter saw, you can also use that to trim the edges. So I just put it flush up against the back of my crosscut sled so I know it's square, and then just run the edge through the table saw basically to square it up. Make sure to keep your hands clear of the blade, obviously. Flip it over. Use the same edge as a reference, that way you know it's a square to the other side. Run it through again, and you're trimmed up on your edges. So I like to run a chamfer around my boards most of the time. People use roundovers or juice grooves too. You can do whatever you want. I like to point out though, when I do route around the edges, I start on the end grain, and then I go around the corner and down the face grain and end on a face grain. If you start on the end grain and end on the end grain, a lot of times it will tear out the corner. But if you give it that little bit of relief to end on right there, then it usually won't tear out anything. I'm using a 45-degree bit here. That's what I like to use. It's all personal preference though, really. So now the fun part is sanding. Not the fun part. My least favorite part. But basically I start out with, I use two different sanders. This one's a little more aggressive than the other one. I start out with 180 grit, I believe, is what I start out with. 150 or 180. It doesn't really matter, just to kind of knock down anything that's more rough from the planer. If you have a nick in your blades or something, there's a ridge, just to kind of get it all flattened out. So I do the front or the back first typically, and then I move to the front. Just kind of make a few passes, evenly up and down the board. So once you get done sanding the top, move on to the sides. You can use a hand block with sandpaper on it to do this if you don't feel comfortable holding the sander perfectly square to the board. I've done so many of these, I know where to hold it basically. So I do the same thing on the chamfers, which is a little more challenging, not to round over the corners. But like I say, I've done a ton of these boards, and I'm comfortable holding it with a sander. But you're more than welcome to do it by hand. Then I take my air hose and I blow out all the dust from the crevices and the pores and all that out of the board, just to make sure it's clean. And then I spray it with water. They call this raising the grain. Basically, when you sand, it smashes down all the grain, all the fibers in the wood. So this raises them back up. So that way, when you go to sand again, it makes gets that all gone, and then that way when you wash the board, it doesn't make it all fuzzy feeling. And then you're gonna want to sand again. I usually do 220 and then 320. You don't have to. I've done it to just 220 before, but basically just go over what you did already. This is a second sander I use. It's less aggressive than my Makita, um, and this is what I use for finish sanding. So just go over it like you did with the other. Do the sides and the chamfers as well. Make sure to get all of it nice and smooth. And then I always blow it out with air again just to make sure all of the dust is out from the cracks and the crevices and the pores and all that in the wood. A lot of wood is more porous than others, so you just want to make sure it's all clean. Blow out the end grain and stuff like that. I personally do all my boards with walrus oil. It's a blend of mineral oil and some other different things. You can use Howard's Butcher Block oil or even just mineral oil. The thing is, with walrus oil, you usually only have to do one coat. If you do a thicker coat like I do, it seems to bring out more coloring in the wood. It's a richer color, and it doesn't seem that you have to oil as often with it. So I really like that stuff. So I always do the back first, the back and the sides and the edges, and then I flip it over and do the front. I put probably a little bit too much on there, but like I said, I like to do a thick coat. So brush it evenly. I like to use a foam brush because you can it holds the oil really well, and then you can just put it in a Ziploc and reuse it hundreds of times. I've probably used this one 20, 30 times already, and it's still perfectly fine. And it doesn't seem to waste as much oil because, like I say, it stays in the brush. So that's about it. Usually let it sit overnight, let the oil soak in, and then wipe the excess off, and you're pretty much ready to go. Hope you guys enjoyed watching. I'm going to try to do some more videos like this in the future. Give me a thumbs up, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you enjoyed it, give me some feedback on the style video. If you like this style or a different style, please let me know. Hope you guys have a good one. Thanks for watching.